All right, good morning. We're going to get started here. Welcome to the NNP Symposium online or to Central States if you're here in person. I have a little bit of a longer spiel for this first one. The rest of the week, we'll have a shorter intro. So the NNP Symposium began in 2020. We started as a fully online numismatic convention with educational talks. Starting with last spring, we've worked with Central States to have a hybrid experience in the spring, so we have an in-person option as well. So we're excited to be back. We are sponsored by EPNIS, the Eric P. Newman Numismatic Education Society. So we're very grateful to them. We're going to kick things off this morning with our Focus on Franklin series. This is the first time that we've had a few different kind of clusters of presentations that are themed together. So the first three presentations today are all focused around Benjamin Franklin's contributions to numismatics. And in the next hour, we'll be joined by Franklin himself. So don't be sure to catch that one. We're going to start things off with Farley Grubb. So Farley, let's just make sure that your audio is working. Say hello.
Hello, I'm here.
All right, great. We're all coming through. And I left my notes over there. One second. All right. So Farley Grubb has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He is now a professor at the University of Delaware and a National Bureau of Economic Research associate. He's also the author of The Continental Dollar, How the American Revolution Was Financed with Paper Money. So today we're going to be hearing about the Continental Dollar, which Franklin was involved with. So Farley, I'm gonna let you take it away. I'll be back during the Q&A portion. We'll be taking questions from both online and in the room. If you're online, you can send them in with the Q&A button at any time, but we will answer them all at the end. So that's it for me. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can get this working. There we go. This is a little bit of a shameless plug for my book I just published last year, The Continental Dollar, How the American Revolution Was Financed with Paper Money. It's quite a radical reinterpretation on a lot of margins. Now, I'm an economist, not a numinist. I even have a hard time pronouncing that word, but I use a lot of and read a lot of numinist work and used a lot of Eric Newman's work on paper money in colonial America. So that's kind of what brings me here. So my interest in this has a lot to do with the structure of money. And numinous work looks a lot at what's on money or written on money. And for me, I think of that as part of the contract about what money is, and things like how it can be redeemed, what its value is, what denomination it has, what resolutions you have to go read to figure out how it works. All that matters to me as an economist, even though in some ways that's numinist work. So I'm going to focus kind of on some of the early stuff in the book. And if you like it, you can buy it on Amazon for 65 bucks, or I can send you a postcard, or if you really like it, you can get the tattoo. Okay. I'm going to focus on choices made by Congress in their early deliberations on how to structure money. And Franklin plays a little bit of a role there, although I won't talk at length about Franklin. He shows up a little later in this stuff. Let me start by just simply saying, why did Congress construct the Continental Dollar the way it did? It had choices to make, a lot of choices and deliberations, and a lot of these aren't thought of. We think of Congress as just, oh, we need money, let's just print paper money and spend it and end of story. And I try to point out that's not the end of story. There's a lot of choices amongst alternatives to figure out how to finance the revolution. Before I do that, let me also mention kind of how do we know what we know about these choices and deliberations. And part of the problem is we don't have a lot of direct evidence. That's why looking actually at what's printed and then a few deliberation tidbits here and there gives us a lot of clue as to what's going on. If you go to the Journals of the Continental Congress, all 34 volumes, they don't tell us deliberations. They tell us resolutions, they tell us decisions, but they don't tell us the debate about how they got to it. If you go to the letters of the delegates to the Continental Congress, all 24 volumes of those letters, Now, congressmen were sworn to secrecy in their deliberations. They were not supposed to reveal how they debated or things like that. You know, they could reveal what the resolutions were, but not what the deliberations were. And when I read through those 24 volumes, the congressmen were really good. They didn't they didn't talk about any of the deliberations. There's one exception, and that is in those volumes. It's a 1979 series by Paul Smith. They include diary entries, not letters, but diary entries by the delegate from New Jersey, Richard Smith. And Richard Smith tells us some very important things about how they debated and deliberated to make choices to create the Continental dollar. So I'll use a little bit of Richard Smith, and then the rest we have to deduce from what they did. So let me start by mentioning that you got to fund the revolution, and you don't have, Congress can't tax anything. They're going to have to do something in terms of money. The first thing that happens on the second day of the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775, well, the battles of Lexington and Concord had happened in April. Massachusetts had organized this militia to put the British under siege in Boston, and they had to fund this event. To do that, Massachusetts printed basically bonds that were a paper money. And they said, these will be redeemed in a couple years with interest paid in specie, and we're going to print these and use these to pay for our militia and for supplies. And they came to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia and they said, give this a currency throughout the colonies so that all the other colonies will accept this stuff as money and payment. In a sense, what Massachusetts was doing was saying, let's fund the revolution by creating a currency union. All the individual colonies printed their own kinds of paper money. You know, you read through Eric Newman's book on the early paper money of America, and you can see all the variety of paper money being issued. Massachusetts was proposing a currency union. Let's all accept each other's paper money, and that's how we can fund this. Now, Congress didn't do that. Why? The best I could find was, now you got to do a lot of reading. So if you read through Jared Sparks' 1834 biography of Gouverneur Morris, who is a delegate to Congress from New York, Jared Sparks includes letters, secret letters sent between the Assembly in New York and the delegates for New York in Congress. And in those letters, they say, first of all, don't let any of the other congressmen see these letters. Keep it secret, but try to dissuade them from a currency union. You know, try to make them issue their own separate national currency, not obligate us New Yorkers to accepting Massachusetts paper money. And so the arguments in Congress went, and what Congress ended up doing was not doing a currency union, but instead creating its own paper money to help fund the revolution. So this is a new money. And so they had a lot of choices over how to make this money function, how to structure it. First choice they have to make is, do we create a national bond-like currency, or do we create something else like a fiat money? Well, a lot of scholars have called the Continental dollar a fiat money, but if you look at it, no one knew what fiat money was. There was no such thing as fiat money in the colonial period. There was only bond type money. There were obligations that legislatures had that they had to redeem at a future date, and either they paid interest or they didn't pay interest, but there were always a bond structure with a redemption structure to it. So basically, Congress is going to end up adopting something similar to what all the colonies had done, and that is issue a paper money that was a bond type money. Now, if you're going to issue something that's a bond type money, and I guess just to show you a little bit, come down, we got some pictures. Here's a $20 bill from the first emission, $2 bill from the second emission. Again, what you see printed on it is that it has a specie value in Spanish silver dollars. All of these have this. And it says that's what the bearer gets. But the question is, when does the bearer get this? And you have to read each one of these to say, according to the resolutions in Congress, and then they give a date. Here's a couple other examples. Again, the bearer gets some Spanish silver dollars or the equivalent in gold and silver, but when do they get it? You got to go read the resolution to figure out when that happens. Whoops, wrong way, sorry. Well, if you're going to create a bond type currency, first thing you got to do is figure out, well, when will it be redeemed at face value? So you got a, $1 Continental dollar. When do I get $1 worth of gold or equivalent in value? Well, they have to make that decision, and there the decision appears to be, we won't redeem this until we think the revolution will be over. And in the first two emissions, there's 11 emissions of this stuff. In the first two emissions, they explicitly set a redemption date into the future. And from what I can gather, reading a few of the congressmen, for example, Silas Dean says he didn't think the revolution would last 7 years. And if you read Thomas Jefferson, he said when the revolution happened, we couldn't sell our goods. We couldn't get gold and silver because we had to export stuff, and we couldn't do that because of the war. We had to wait for the war to be over in order to have taxes to get paid in gold and silver in order to pay off these bond type notes, these Continental dollars. So they push the redemption structure forward in time from when they issue this. So it's at some future date. The second thing they have to do is choose, do you have a redemption year or point, or do you have a window of years in which this stuff is redeemed? Now, if you look at that choice, if you go back to the colonies, some colonies, well, actually only one, Maryland, used a redemption point. If you look at Maryland's first paper money, 1733, they said, we're going to issue all this money in 1733, and all of it will be redeemed in 1764, all in 1 year. Boom. Most colonies didn't do that. Most colonies, when they issued money, had it redeemed in a window of years, like a 4-year window or a 6-year window where they redeemed fixed amounts at a given time. And that's what Congress did. So let me run down to the first two emissions. First emission here in May of 1775, they said, when is it going to be redeemed? We're going to start redeeming it 4 years from now, 4.5 years from now, and we're going to redeem 1/4 of it each year, November 30th of that year. And then when you look at the second emission from November 1775, again, they said, okay, we're going to redeem this, but we're going to push it forward in time, and we're going to redeem 1/4 in each of the 4 contiguous years. Now, why did they do that? Whoops. Page up, page. No, other way. Why did they do that? As far as I can tell, they did that in order to spread taxes out to make them fiscally feasible. You got a big chunk of money. It's $3 million being emitted. When I calculate out what the tax incidence would be, or the tax amount would be each year to redeem that. So we got to tax in goods or gold and silver and use that to redeem this paper money. When I calculate that out, if you tried to redeem all that in 1 year, the taxes would be way above what they were used to, and people couldn't pay that. So they had to spread the taxes out over time to make sure each year's taxes were within what was fiscally feasible for the citizens to pay. So that kind of explains why you have a window rather than a redemption point. Now, to have a redemption window creates a little bit of a problem for using this Continental dollars as money, as a medium of exchange. And that's because these Continental dollars, if they're redeemed in different years, are going to have different present values. In other words, you say, gee, if I have a Continental dollar and it's going to be redeemed in 1779, or it could be redeemed in 1782, I'd rather have the one that's redeemed in 1779 because I'm going to get that quicker. And so the value of the Continental dollar is going to have some different present values depending on what year you think it's going to be redeemed in. Now, they never actually fixed for a given emission what Continental dollar would be redeemed in which year within that window. So 1779 to 1783, what year will your Continental dollar be redeemed in? They have no mechanism was established to do that. I'm guessing it was first come, first serve. Rush to the Continental Treasury, say, I got here first, give me the gold and silver behind this Continental dollar. And if you didn't get there in time, well, you had to wait a year. What that means is, again, the present value of this stuff has a realized value around some range. It's not a fixed value. That makes it a cumbersome medium of exchange. You're going to trade in it, but you're not real sure what value this is going to have because you don't know exactly what year you're going to get to redeem it in. So that makes for a cumbersome medium of exchange. Why they did this was to make it fiscally credible. So I'm going to go through and say every choice they make is to side on making the Continental dollar fiscally credible, that taxes will be paid in the future to do this, and not worry about whether it's an easy medium of exchange or not. So besides the redemption, then they have to figure out, well, who's going to do the redeeming? Congress can't tax. They don't have any power to tax. The people who have power to tax are the individual states. So the individual states are going to have to put taxes in to redeem the Continental dollars and pay them off at the dates that Congress sets. How do you apportion those redemption obligations amongst the states? Well, again, we don't have a lot of debate, but we can see in the resolutions they decide to apportion it by population across the states. And you can see this in some of the early resolutions. I don't know if you can read it, but in the slideshow, they set out this discussion about how the Continental dollar was going to work. This is a broadside that was sent out to all the colonists. It was reprinted in a lot of the newspapers in the colony. And there on the right-hand column, they list the individual states and what the individual states have to do in terms of redeeming their share of the Continental dollar. And it was basically proportioned by the population share in the Union. Whoops, other way. So go back to my little list. Now, this created a little bit of a problem later on that I'm not going to talk about in detail. You got to read the book to see it. Most of the Continental dollars are going to be spent on soldiers and on supplies for soldiers. That means they're going to be spent where, the theater of war is. And that starts out to be in New England and then is mostly concentrated in the middle states from New York to Philadelphia. That's where that money is going to be spent. It's not really going to be spent in Georgia or someplace like that. And yet all the states have to redeem this stuff. So there's an initial imbalance in where the money's at and who has to, tax and then redeem this stuff in gold and silver equivalents. So how do you solve that imbalance of where the paper money's at and who has the obligations to redeem it? So again, they proportion this redemption by population because they think that's kind of the fairest way to do because population is a good measure of economic ability. But what they do also to solve this imbalance of where Continental dollars are spent and where they have to be redeemed is they create what I call a species redemption option at face value at the Continental Treasury. What does that mean? What that means is I have a Continental dollar and my state has already redeemed all the Continental dollars that they're required to redeem and I still have one. What do I do with it? My state's no longer going to have to obligate it to redeem it. Well, I can go to the Continental Treasury and say, my state's redeemed all it, but I still have one. You have to redeem it. Now, for states that didn't have enough Continental dollars, say like Georgia, don't have many Continental dollars, they have to redeem their share. They have to make up the shortfall by sending in gold and silver. They have to send to the Continental Treasury the balance that they owe, not in Continental dollars because they don't have them, but in the gold and silver equivalent. So if I have a Continental dollar and I'm in Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania has already redeemed all these Continental dollars, I can go to the Continental Treasury and say, well, Georgia's sending you gold and silver for their share because they don't have Continental dollars. I want that gold and silver. So that's rebalancing, basically, to make sure that all Continental dollars get redeemed, either by their state at their quota or at the Continental Treasury by gold and silver sent from states who don't have that quota. Now, this process was used by every colony when they issued paper money within their colonies. They knew who had paper money, and the tax obligations to pay that weren't equivalent when the paper money was due to be redeemed. And so how did they rebalance it? They said, well, if you owe taxes but don't have paper money, you got to pay your taxes in gold and silver or goods or something like that. And then if I have paper money and it's more than what I have to pay taxes in, I can go to the Treasury, and the excess paper money I have, I can get the gold and silver or goods that other people paid into the Treasury. And that rebalances it across citizens or subjects. So this would have been a very familiar clause in the resolutions that people would have understood. Yeah, this is going to rebalance who has paper money and how it gets taxed. Now, we're not done. There's a lot more structure that has to be done here. And one of the things is we're going to issue this paper money, and we're going to have it redeemed in 4 years, in a 4-year window, 4 years from now, 4 to 7 years. But the revolution is going to keep going, and we're going to have to issue more. And there's going to be a total of 11 emissions starting in 1775 up through 1779. And for each new emission, do we have it redeemed in the same window of time, or do we move that window of time forward? And this was a debate early on in the Continental Congress, and doesn't show up in the journals of the Continental Congress, but it shows up in the diaries of Richard Smith. So let's take a look at Richard. There's Richard Smith, not kind of a homely looking founding father. He's from New Jersey. His brother is the treasurer of New Jersey, in charge of issuing New Jersey paper money during the colonial period. Richard Smith will be in the Continental Congress, and he'll end up coming back in 1776 to New Jersey to take over being treasurer there because his older brother dies. He knows a lot about paper money. And we'll see later, he's actually one of the endorsers of New Jersey paper money in the late colonial period. Okay, so Richard Smith writes in his diary, he says, okay, what happens? We got to have this second emission. So maybe I'll come down and show you the second emission. So the second emission was in November 1775. It was another 3 million. And initially they're saying, what should we do with this? And Richard Smith says in his diary, well, initially, James Duane, delegate from New York, said, we should redeem this in the same 4 windows that we redeem the first emission. So up there, 1779 to 1782. We should now make that 6 million, and we'll redeem that in those 4 windows. And Richard Smith says this was debated. It was debated a lot, and they said, basically came to a conclusion, no, that what we're going to do for this second emission is move it forward in time. Same 4-year window, but it's going to start when the first emission is fully redeemed. So it's going to start in 1783 and go for 4 years to 1786. This sets a pattern. This really establishes the pattern that you can form expectations for how emissions are going to work. Each new emission is going to be moved forward in time in terms of when it's going to be redeemed, and it's going to be a window of years after the prior emission is redeemed. Now, if you look at why they did this, again, they don't exactly tell you. They tell you they debated it, and they told you they rejected Duane, and they accepted this move, kind of forward staggered redemption. When I go down and calculate the tax implications of this, what this does is it keeps the per year taxes on average at about what people expected them to be in the late colonial period. That they were fiscally credible, that you knew people could pay these taxes because that's what they paid before the war. Where if you didn't do that, if you said, let's redeem the second emission, that second 3 million in the same 4 years as the first 3 million, that would double the amount of taxes you had to pay each year. And that would push it way beyond what people were used to paying and probably outside what they were capable of paying, in which case it wouldn't be paid and you'd have a problem. So you look at this and you say, okay, they're really trying to set it up so that future taxes to meet the redemption of this stuff will be credible, that people can pay them. It's within their fiscal set. But by doing that, they also make this a more cumbersome medium of exchange. If you look at this and you say, I got two Continental dollars. I got one from the first emission and one from the second emission. The first emission, I know I'm going to get redeemed sometime earlier than the second emission. So if I have a choice to make, I'd rather have one from the first emission because it's going to get redeemed earlier. The second emission, I'm going to have to wait longer, so it's not going to be as valuable. The present value is going to be different between these two emissions. So you got a very cumbersome medium of exchange. What you're saying to trade with this stuff, not only does the realized value of a dollar from one emission have a little bit of variation depending on what year it gets redeemed within this window, but a dollar from the two different emissions are going to have different present values because the later one's going to be redeemed later. That makes for a very cumbersome medium of exchange when you have two seemingly identical Continental dollars have different present values. The only reason I can see for them doing this is they realized they needed this to be fiscally credible. They cared about that more than they cared about, is this going to be an easy money to use and trade with? Go back up. Okay. Before I go to the zero coupon bond stuff, this was a pattern that was well known in the colonial period. If you look at what colonies did, they basically issued paper money, and for every issue, they pushed it forward in time and staggered it through a window. So let me give you an example. This is from New Jersey. This is New Jersey paper money issued during the French and Indian War. And you can see on the left-hand column a number of different emissions as they're trying to pay for this war. And throughout, what you're seeing is for each emission, they're going to redeem it at some future dates. And they're going to have a 3-year, or in some cases, a 6-year window to redeem this stuff with an equal amount each year. And as they issue more of this, they push it forward in time, the redemptions forward in time. And they stagger them about so that when you look at the bottom column, basically the tax amount is going to be pretty constant each year. So people can pay this stuff each year. But what it means is for the stuff that's going to be redeemed quite later, if you look at that last emission in 1764, it's not going to be redeemed until the 1780s. It means those things being issued have a much lower present value because they're not going to be redeemed until way in the future, as opposed to stuff that's going to be redeemed closer to the present. But this was a common pattern. Citizens would have expected this from the Continental dollar and what they did. So let me go back up. Whoops, back down. Okay, one of the most controversial things that I do in the book is to say, okay, Congress also has to make a choice. They're going to issue this thing that has a redemption in gold and silver or its specie equivalent at some future date. So it's a bond. Now, the question is, should this bond pay interest in the meantime, pay yearly interest, or should it be what's called a zero coupon bond? Not pay interest at all, you just redeem it at some future date. A zero coupon bond, that's very much like a U.S. savings bond. If you got a U.S. savings bond, if grandma gave you a U.S. savings bond that said $100, on it, and you tried to cash it in tomorrow, you wouldn't get $100. You only get $100 like 20 years from now. That's when it'd be worth $20. Or sorry, $100. If you cash it in, today, you'd get some small amount. And that's because the interest earned is built in to that. So again, it's a zero coupon bond. You don't get any interest each year. You got to hold on to it until you get to that redemption date. So a U.S. savings bond is very much like a Continental dollar in that sense. You got a face value, but you don't get the face value now. You get the face value at some real future date. Now, what that means is the present value. If you get this Continental dollar and you know it's going to be redeemed way in the future, the present value today is going to be way below that face value. Just like a U.S. savings bond, the value you get for it today is way below that face value if you cash it in now and don't wait until it matures. The only way to counteract that is to pay interest each year that makes up for that lower present value. And so if you have an interest-bearing bond that pays the market interest rate each year, that face value is going to be what you can trade it for. Where if you have a zero coupon bond, you can't trade it at its face value. You got to trade it way below its face value. Doesn't mean it's depreciated, just means that it's not going to get paid off until some future date. So Congress had to make a choice there. And they actually debated this choice. And again, it's not in the Journal of Continental Congress, it's not in the letters, but it's in Richard Smith's diary. And here's where Ben Franklin comes in. Committee was put together. Ben Franklin was a member of it. And the committee went and looked at the first two emissions that we had, the first 6 million, and they came back with some recommendations. And one of the recommendations was that they should call in the 6 million, the first two emissions, and issue new money, one that's much bigger, so instead of a $1 Continental dollar, we should have a $100 Continental dollar, and even bigger money in that sense. And they should also pay yearly interest on this money. And as far as I can tell, that yearly interest suggestion was a Benjamin Franklin suggestion. If you go back and you look at Benjamin Franklin's discussions about Pennsylvania paper money, those discussions involved, if you want our paper money to circulate at face value, you got to do something to counteract the lower present value due to the delayed redemption. To counteract that, you got to pay yearly interest. And he said, so that's what we got to do if we want this stuff to circulate at face value. He understood that. He understood that yearly interest counteracted the lower present value from a zero coupon bond. And he recommended that. Was never adopted by Pennsylvania, but it's recommended by this committee of which he is a member. And interesting enough, 1779, in a letter that he writes from Paris to a friend, Cooper, he says, the Continental dollar, what a disaster. I tried to fix it back then. I proposed these things, but they didn't listen to me and didn't do what I suggested. And that was paying interest in order to make this stuff circulate at face value. So, and as far as I know, this is the only kind of Richard Smith's diary is the only corroboration I know of that Franklin actually did propose doing that, and it got rejected by Congress. Now, why Congress rejected that, they don't say. My guess is Congress simply didn't have the funds to pay a yearly interest amount, whether it was in specie, gold and silver, or in some other thing. Congress had no power to tax. They could beg the French for bills of exchange, but even that they probably couldn't use to pay annual interest. And again, most colonies' paper monies didn't pay an annual interest. A few did, but most didn't. So people were familiar with paper monies that paid no annual interest and were redeemed at some big future date. So Congress rejects paying interest on this stuff. This stuff is going to be a zero coupon bond. Okay, we got a few more choices to make. Going to create this Continental dollar. So create this Continental dollar. Are we going to make it a legal tender? Okay. Well, Congress doesn't make it a legal tender. Why? They don't tell us. My guess is they didn't think they had the power to do it, or they thought they didn't have the power to do it. So the first several emissions of this stuff circulate as a money without any legal tender connected to it. Now, initially, I do some calculations in the book. Initially, almost all of this stuff is used to pay soldiers and to pay for salaries for people employed by the national government. Those people have no choice. A soldier basically has his pay set in 1775, in July of 1775 in Continental dollars, and that's what they got to accept. No choice here. So being a legal tender or not doesn't really matter. You just pay you say this is what you're getting as a Continental soldier. Now, by the time we get to like the Sixth Amendment, by the time we get to 1777, when I kind of calculate how this stuff is being paid, more now is being used to buy supplies in the marketplace, to buy, whether it's gunpowder, whether it's to buy clothing, whether it's to buy food. They're going out into the marketplace and they're buying this stuff from purveyors. And the problem is a purveyor could refuse to accept a Continental dollar. It's not a legal tender. You want to buy food for the army? I want something else. I don't want this piece of paper, and I can refuse it. That's when Congress turns to the states and asks the individual states, make the Continental dollar a legal tender within your state. Please, please, please. And the states responded, and they very quickly moved to make Continental dollars a legal tender within their state. And again, I think this was driven by having to make sure that market suppliers couldn't refuse a Continental dollar. They had to accept it, not necessarily at face value, but had to accept it in payment for food, clothing, supplies for the army. So all the states kind of did this relatively quickly. By I think the Eighth Emission, the Continental dollar, by 1777, the Continental dollar is a legal tender in most states. So it starts out not being a legal tender and then is made a legal tender. So they do that. The last thing we kind of have to do, I guess, well, let me just mention a little more about legal tender. Legal tender basically forced you to accept this thing in payment, but it didn't control your prices. So you say, I'm forced to take a Continental dollar. It's circulating way below its face value because it's not going to be redeemed until way out in the future. I'm not going to take it at face value. Legal tender laws didn't force you to take it at face value in terms of the prices you charge. You say, well, if I got to take it at face value, I'm just going to raise my prices in order to reflect the fact that this isn't the face value isn't its real value in the marketplace today. So one of the ways of explaining the rise in prices that occurs in Continental dollars is, again, purveyors have to accept these things, but they're going to raise their prices to make sure they're getting the true present value of this stuff rather than the face value, which they won't get until some long future date. What legal tender laws really did was they kind of drove pricing to be in the legal tender. So you're going to say, I'm going to price my goods. You're saying the price of this Continental dollar and the price of, say, a Pennsylvania pound or specie, that it's all supposed to be the same. And you're going to say, well, no, I can't do that because the Continental dollar isn't worth as much. Its present value has fallen a lot because it's not going to be redeemed for a long time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my prices, but I'm only going to set my prices in Continental dollars and set it at the right high price to counteract the fact that its present value is very low. So legal tender laws tended to drive pricing into what the legal tender was. It didn't control those prices, though. And I kind of, one point in the book, I go through and I put together, like 15,000 transactions to look at what was chosen. And certainly they shifted to pricing in Continental dollars very quickly after it was made a legal tender. The last thing we have to look at, that's a choice, is denominational spacing and denominational size. Now this, I know some numinists look at this, that's what's on the face of this stuff. So again, if I go down and look at this, here's a $20 bill. Here's a $2 bill. There's a $3 bill. There's a $65 bill. So one of the things that's printed on these things is what the denomination is. So one of the things we want to look at is this is a new money. We could choose any denominational structure we wanted. And we could choose any denominational size we want. Why did we choose the particular denominational spacing and size that we did? Why did Congress do that? again, there's no records of these choices. So we kind of have to look at it and deduce what might have been the purpose. And what I'm going to show you is Congress chose the most bizarre denominational spacing of any money I've ever seen anywhere in the universe throughout space and time. This is so bizarre that it implies they must have had some plan, because all the people doing this in Congress were familiar with colonial paper money and familiar with gold and silver coin money. They knew about denominational spacing. Some of them had been involved in the treasuries of their colonies, and yet they chose the spacing for the Continental dollar that is incredibly bizarre. So let me kind of come down and show you some of that spacing. Oh, let me just point out, here's Richard Smith on a New Jersey note. He's the middle signer there of that. So he knew what he was going on. So let's take a look at a little bit of denominational structure. So here's the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, first 7 emissions going up there. And if we look at the denominational spacing over in the left-hand column, there's the face value. That's in Spanish silver dollars. If you look at that face value and the spacing, those first 2 emissions, you have a $1 bill, a $2 bill, a $3 bill, a $4 bill, a $5 bill, a $6 bill, a $7 bill, an $8 bill, and then you get a $20 bill and a $30 bill. But that core spacing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that is absolutely bizarre. There is no money in the universe that has that kind of spacing. And then if you look across, these emissions going out, it's basically the same. They do drop the $1 bill by the time you get to emission 1, 2, 3, 4, emission 5, but still you have the spacing of $2 bill, $3 bill, $4 bill, $5 bill, $6 bill, $7 bill, $8 bill. That belies any logic that most people have when they've studied how do you optimally space money. Now, economists have done a little bit of analysis of spacing, and some of it's a little mathematically technical, but the basic notion is that you create denominational spacing in order to make money easy to use, in order to be able to make change. So, for example, our spacing of the US dollar is, we have a penny, a nickel, a dime, a quarter, 50-cent piece, a $1 bill, we won't count the $2 bill, a $5 bill, a $10 bill, a $20 bill, $50 bill, and a $100 bill. So some spacing there like that. Now, when you kind of measure out and kind of mathematically calculate that spacing, people have argued that, you tend to see spacing that is in what they call binary triplets. And this is spacing where it allows you to make change very easily, no matter what you're doing. And it's also spacing that has easy ability to calculate. So you tend to see spacing that falls on units of 5. So like a $5 bill, a $10 bill, $20 bill, 50. So you see those 5s. You also see spacing that has what we call a factor of 2. So you'd have a 1, 2, 5, 10, 20. If you divide it out, that's how they talk about it. If you go look at the euro, if you go look at the yen, you get similar kinds of spacing. And the thinking is you're trying to make this easy to calculate in order to make it an easy medium of exchange, and trying to make it easy to make change in this stuff. Okay, so why would you do this kind of spacing? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Absolutely bizarre. Why do that? Again, I'd say they're not crazy. All these people knew about other kinds of money and what their spacing is. Colonial paper money had spacing more like modern money. Coin denominations had spacing more like modern money, not like this. Well, the other thing to consider is denominational size. Except for emission number 3 that has some fractions of $1 units and very few, the smallest unit issued in most cases is a 1 Continental dollar. That turns out to be really big. And then in the later emissions, the smallest unit is a 2 Continental dollar. value-wise, that turns out to be a really big value. So today it'd kind of be like saying, well, suppose the only money, US dollars we had were like $50 bills and nothing else, nothing smaller. How could we trade with that? How could we make change? I'd go in to my 5 and dime and I'd want to buy a couple candy bars, and I'd say, well, the smallest I got is a $50 bill. And they look at me and they say, we can't make change. We'll have to give you something else. We'll give you some other items, or you got to, in other words, it's a very cumbersome medium of exchange because it's too big in terms of value. And I tried to do that here in the second column. I recalculated the face value of Continental dollars into 2012 US dollars. It's kind of a lengthy algorithm to do that. And a one Continental dollar is the equivalent to a $31 bill today. If you look at a 5 Continental dollars, it's a $155 bill. Really, really big money. And so the question is, well, not only do we have this bizarre spacing, but we're going to make this money really big. And that means it's going to be difficult to use. So why? And the argument I give, again, some lengthy chapters in the book, is they're using most of this early on to pay soldiers. And if you look at soldiers' pay, they'd be able to pay a soldier with only a few bills. So if you look at a monthly, what's the monthly pay to a soldier? I could pay that soldier in like a $2 bill and a $3 bill. So I give you 2 bills, big money. It's really hard for you to spend it. And if you look at higher officers' pay, it's even easier to pay them in very few large bills. And I think the thinking they had was, we got to pay these soldiers and we're going to pay them in such large denominations that it's going to be difficult to spend. They got to hold them. They got to hold them until after the war and then redeem them when we can place taxes. And so the thinking was, well, this stuff won't be spent. It won't affect the economy. People will have to hold them. And I got a few quotes, not of soldiers of the line, but of a few officers saying, yeah, I collected my pay and I held it, hoping that after the war, you'd redeem this as you promised and make my life better in old age. Things like, I think General Parsons made that claim to Congress. But so I think the bizarre spacing is connected to the fact that the lowest denomination is still really big. To give you some idea of how big a one Continental dollar is, it only took one Continental dollar to pay for a soldier's week of housing and food in Philadelphia while waiting to join their regiment. So yeah, so you think, the smallest bill we got is a week's worth of housing and food. That's really big. What that means is, to use Continental dollars as a medium of exchange, you're going to have to use change in something else, goods, or the individual states' paper monies. And individual states were all issuing their own paper monies, Pennsylvania pounds, Virginia pounds, New Jersey pounds. They were all issuing their own paper monies during the Revolution. And so I think part of the thinking was that there'd be a separation here, that Continental dollars would be zero coupon bonds that you'd hold and not spend for redemption after the Revolution. If you had to spend them, the actual day-to-day transactions would use state paper monies that were in much smaller denominations. And I try to give a little bit of a analysis here of what that meant. So this is all in US 2012 dollar equivalents, and then the percentage of units that are below these US dollars. So in other words, kind of look at what's in really small change units and what's not. And what you can see is, if you look at the colonies during the Revolution, New York, Pennsylvania, the first there, and you look at the states, and then the colonies right before the Revolution, Pennsylvania, Virginia, they have a tremendous amount of units of paper money that are below $5 in value, very small. You can easily trade with them, make change, use them as a medium of exchange. If you look at the Continental dollar, very few units, no units below $5, very few units below $25 or $20 equivalents. Most of the units are, above $100. So again, very hard to use. So I think there was a separation of thinking here on how this stuff was going to get used. Uh, State paper money would be used in everyday transactions. Continental dollars, they were hoping would be held for redemption. Now they ended up not getting held, and I'll mention that in a second. The place we can see this that's kind of interesting is if you look at the bottom, New York during the 7 Years' War looks very much like the Continental dollar. New York's the only colony that issued really large pieces of paper money during a war, and that was the French and Indian War. Same basic idea. We're hoping people will simply hold this and not spend it because it's too hard to spend. And then if you look at what they do during the Revolution, New York shifts to being at the top, issuing really small denomination paper money that's easy to use as trade. So they make a real change in this. And again, that's kind of speaks to the strategies of how they think this money is going to be used. Okay, so let me kind of go back up here to my list of things to do. So that kind of governs all these choices. And it's a massive amount of choices for which we've had very little discussion of what's going on. I'll kind of finish here and then open it for questions by kind of talking a little bit about some of the highlights I have in the book that I can't go into detail. First of all, one of the things I do in the book is I do a massive amount of forensic accounting. And I look at, there's a whole range of estimates of the amount of Continental dollars emitted. And I try to reconcile all those estimates and get down to one estimate. And when I do that, there's fewer Continental dollars emitted than traditionally thought. There's basically 200 million. Some of the estimates out there are the consensus estimate is around 241 million, and I show that's wrong. I go through and I show that everyone knew that the Continental dollar was a zero coupon bond, not a fiat currency, that it had a bond-like structure, that they expected some redemption in the future. Now, redemption didn't happen the way they thought, but they expected that. I also kind of mentioned this. I argue that fiscal credibility factored into the Continental dollar's redemption structure and value performance. When they changed the redemption rules in a way in 1779 so that it wasn't fiscally credible, that basically destroyed the value of the Continental dollar. So through 1775, the emission of new Continental dollars accounted for roughly 77% of Congressional spending. The first 4 years of the Revolution was fought on the back of the Continental dollar. There is some other funding, but it's really the Continental dollar that's doing this. About 1/3 of the Continental dollars emitted by Congress were borrowed back by Congress from the public and respent. Those were the loan office certificates issued. That was a borrowing mechanism to do that. I've talked about the denominational structure. The really kind of shocking thing I end up kind of going through in a lot of depth is I argue that the Continental dollar did not depreciate before 1779. Let me repeat that. The whole notion we have that the Continental dollar depreciated is a misconception of how you understand what zero coupon bonds are. Yes, the value of these Continental dollars declined and declined precipitously, but they declined precipitously because the redemption of the average Continental dollar was pushed further out into the future as they issued more. So the present value fell, but the expectation that the principal would be redeemed was still there. And as long as the principal is still intact, there's no depreciation. It'd be kind of like saying I got a US savings bond and I can't get the face value for it. Has it depreciated? No. The principal is still going to be paid off at its maturity. It hasn't depreciated. It's just a lower present value because that redemption is in the future. What destroyed the Continental dollar was congressional rule changes in 1779 and 1780 that failed to grasp the need for taxation schemes that were fiscally credible. This comes back to James Duane from New York and some congressmen who really just thought debt is bad, we should raise taxes infinitely and get out of debt, not realizing that people can't pay infinite taxes to do this. And when they got kind of in control, they ended up doing that. And I think that's really what destroyed the system. By 1790, the states had actually redeemed and removed from circulation roughly 60% of the continental dollars ever emitted. This is evidence that's out there that people haven't gone through. And at the end of the book, I kind of go through a lot of work done by Robert Morris and Joseph Noss and Michael Hillegas and Francis Hopkinson. Those are all the treasures that no one talks about. And they put together the redemption structures. And I ended up kind of confirming track that roughly 60% was removed by the states and sent to the Continental Treasury to be burned. Finally, I take a lot of a look at the final default on the Continental dollar in the 1790 Funding Act. And I argue that it was not financially necessary, that they could have redeemed it given the expectations of when it would be redeemed in the future, that wasn't a burdensome cost. And I go through and I show various schemes where they could have continued the redemption structure that they set up in the first emission, and that wouldn't have added much to the debt, and they probably could have gotten away with that pretty easily. But then I also show, and not in the book, but in a paper published in a obscure edited volume, that they may have had a default on the Continental dollar, basically say we're not going to redeem it anymore, in order to wipe it off the books and thus put the U.S. in a positive net worth position. And I kind of show that in 1790, they have a lot more debt from the revolution than what they have assets. All the assets they get are all this land granted in the Treaty of Paris that has value. But if they remove the Continental dollar from the debt side, all of a sudden the land assets are more valuable than the remaining war debt, and that makes them look like a good credit risk, and they can go out and borrow easily on that. So they may have had to default on the Continental dollar just to get into a positive net worth position. Anyway, so that's kind of the story. I think I'm close to the end of my time, and I should open it for questions, because they said we should end, I think, at 10:45.
Yes,
did I guess that right?
We have until about 10:15.
10:15.
Yes. So
your time. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
11:15 my time. Okay. So I'd end here and open it for questions and see how I can confuse people more.
All right. So if you're online, there's a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. You can open that and type in questions to send in. We have Len Augsburger here who will be reading them off from the audience. And for those of you here in Central States, you know how to ask questions. Raise your hand. So we'll be alternating between the two as long as we have questions in both places. And we'll run until we run out of questions or out of time. So who would like to start us off?
Okay. All right. So first question, this is sent in online. Do you believe the layman in the 1700s really understood this concept of present value?
So I do two things. One of the things I do in the book is I read through everything written by, people involved at the time. And so I have a whole chapter where I show that a lot of people understood this as a zero coupon bond. You got Roger Sherman explaining this to the governor of Connecticut and even giving him a present value table to use. You get a lot of other people explaining. Benjamin Franklin explained this back in 1764 clearly to the Pennsylvania legislature. So a lot of the leading lights at least understood this. Question might be, did the average person in the street understand this? And here I got to fall back on being an economist and say they acted as if they understood this. And I get at that by saying the minute that, just saying, let me get here. The minute this broadside shows up in the Pennsylvania papers and they see and they read through, oh, this isn't going to get redeemed until these future years. The minute that shows up, Continental dollars start trading below face value at what you'd expect them to be if they're going to be redeemed at face value at that redemption day. And so at least people in the marketplace seemed to act as if they understood this. I should also say, I've done a lot of, well, here we go, done a lot of analysis of colonial New Jersey, colonial Virginia, colonial North Carolina, and I find the same patterns, that the information they have, if you calculate back what the present value of the paper money would be, that's what it's trading for in the marketplace. So again, it looks as though they operate as if they understood that. Now, trying to find statements of them actually saying that has been really hard. So I won't go that far.
Related question. So there's a lot of canvass and exchange rate tables from this period. Are the different emissions of the continental currency valued differently? So for example, would a note that was to be redeemed in 1783 be trading or evaluated at a different level than one that was going to be redeemed, 7 years later?
Yeah, that was a big initial puzzle for me, and I don't know that people have looked for that. I tried to look for that, and I found a few inklings, but not much. So for example, I think it was Roger Sherman, when he's on the committee to figure out how to pay people, he says, well, we should treat the first emission different from the second emission in terms of what the value is. And that's what he recommends. He recognizes that this is a zero coupon bond. The present value stuff is different. That gets rejected. And they say, no, you agreed to this price. We're just going to pay you the face value. I also find a few things in the Pennsylvania Gazette, especially when I get to 1778, 1779, where people are saying, we'll accept continental dollars at this value of any emission. And they do that. In 1779, for the last emission, Congress passes a new redemption structure. And in that redemption structure, they say, okay, all the continental dollars are going to be in the same redemption window. So that means you can't distinguish between them anymore. And once they do that, I see these ads saying, oh, we'll take these of any emission at this value, as though before that they were doing some side deals, that they don't report. But it's hard to find any kind of information where people are actually doing that difference. Now, I will say, once states make the continental dollar a legal tender, that's the same thing as making them fungible across redemption windows. And so once they make the continental dollar a legal tender, basically they should all have the same present value. So that's 1777. So yeah, it's, I found a little bit of evidence, but not kind of wholesale, large scale evidence showing that difference. It's the best I can tell you.
Okay. Do we have any questions from in the room here?
I have one we talked about the general population, or say a soldier paid in continental dollars, and of course, in the redemption dates, it seems to me the public, just your average soldier or average merchant, was fearful that he'll never see that payment. So but then all the speculators pop up to say, well, we'll pay you half the amount, and then it dwindled down to 10 cents on a dollar. And the general public generally thought, well, it's better than nothing. So they sold their currency before it even got anywhere near a redemption date. Then the question becomes for me is, well, how did the speculators made out? Because there was a lot of speculators in colonial America. I mean, whether it was land speculators, and most of them lost their money. So how about those speculators? How did they make it of buying continental dollars for 10 cents on a dollar?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't get into too much. At the very end in the 1790 Funding Act, where they come in and they say, okay, if you bring in your continental dollars, we'll give you 1 cent on the dollar for it, but not even that, because we're going to give it to you in interest-bearing bonds, and the interest won't kick in some of it for 10 years or so. When they do that, they only get about 6 million continental dollars turned in, even though there's about 74 million outstanding. So there's a lot of people who apparently have continental dollars, and they're not going to turn them in for the new government bonds that are being issued to fund the debt. Why not? Well, what I found was I read through a lot of the letters sent to the Secretaries of Treasury, Hamilton, and then Wolcott, and then Gallatin, because the law says, well, once you get past 1797, if you haven't turned yours in, we give you nothing. So speculators were holding on to this stuff. You see these letters coming in saying, no, change the law. Don't give us 1 penny on the dollar. You got to give us what you promised. You got to give us what what was promised in those resolutions back in 1779 and 1775. Because the Constitution says that all laws from then are still valid. Well, the Secretaries of the Treasury get these letters and they basically point to the 1790 Funding Act, the August 4, 1790 Funding Act, and they said, our hands are tied. That's the law. You turn it in for 1 cent on the dollar or you get nothing. So they lost their money. Speculators lost. In 1834, 1832, 34, when they did a major restudy of this, they ended up concluding that 74 million Continental dollars were never redeemed. They were a total loss to the public, whoever held them. Now, as far as soldiers, yeah, you're right. Soldiers get this stuff. You're in desperate straits. You need to spend this money. You got your soldiers' pay. You're not like some general who can sit on it and wait for the war to be over because you got a big plantation so you got to spend this. You go to spend this and people say, well, we can't give you face value. We're going to give you much less because it's not going to be redeemed for a while. The problem you have is, well, do you believe it's going to be redeemed or not? And I show, this is kind of a convoluted model of money I use. I show that in those first few years, the Continental dollar is trading at a value above what its present value would be if you simply believed that it held on to it and believed it was going to be redeemed when you expected it to be redeemed. So it actually was circulating at an appreciating value. Now below its face value, but above its expected present value. Exactly why is a little unclear, but it could be that Continental dollars were the only money that really could transit state borders. State paper money was only good in those states. You couldn't take a Massachusetts pound and use it in South Carolina and get anything for it. But a Continental dollar you could. So maybe that gave it some extra oomph. Now that disappears. By the time you get to 1777 to 1779, that Continental dollar's present value is tracking pretty closely the expected redemption when you expect it to be redeemed. And then when you get to late 1778 into 1779, that value of that Continental dollar in the marketplace falls below that expected present value. That says, I don't expect them to redeem it. So by the time you get to the end of 1778, there's a lot of people who are using Continental dollars and they're using it at a very low value because they don't trust that it will ever be redeemed. And so there's maybe a little bit of a difference in the market where some people trust it more, some people trust it less, but it's circulating at least up to 1781. It's still circulating, but at a value far below what the real present value should be if people really believe the redemption structure offer. So that's kind of the best I can tell you on that.
All right, I know we've got more of them online.
Yeah, next question from our Virginia currency specialist. How do you factor in the massive counterfeiting into your analysis? That people were counterfeiting the Continental currency.
As far as I can tell, there's one big counterfeiting episode, and it involves, oh God, I forget now, emission 8 and emission 9. Anyway, 2 emissions there in 1778, 1779. 2 emissions. Basically, massive counterfeiting is taking place, and they see that. Turns out they handle that the way colonies handled counterfeiting. I saw this in Virginia for a counterfeiting episode in 1773. Basically, what you do is, we spot that it's being counterfeited. How do we solve this? We announce everyone who has bills from these 2 emissions that we believe are being counterfeited, you have to bring them in to the loan office or the treasury, and you have to swap them, one for one for new bills that we're going to print that aren't counterfeited yet. And they do this for the emission, the last emission in 1779 has a massive chunk that isn't new. It's all to be swapped dollar for these prior two emissions. And I went through and tried to track how long that happened. And it looks like they did. They swapped them all out, you know, in terms of the amount. And that's what Virginia did back in 1773. They had an emission that was being counterfeited. And besides tracking down the counterfeiters and hanging them, they said, okay, you got to bring in the money that's being counterfeited. We'll look at it. We'll see if it's genuine. If it is, we're going to swap it for some new stuff we printed. And my calculation in Virginia is that altered the present value by a couple percentage points, not more than 10 percentage points in terms of fear of not being able to swap or that you had counterfeited money. I couldn't really do that for the Continental dollar, but what I could do is track that. You bring it in, they look at it, they match up the serial numbers. They know, oh, you got a genuine one. We'll give you a new dollar from the last emission and swap it out. So as far as I could tell, they solved that problem pretty easily. Now, that's the problem from the national level. You know, how it affected, a lot of this counterfeiting was being done in New York. How that affected kind of merchants and other people right in on the spot, I don't know. New York's been a hard place to study.
All right, we probably got time for about one more question. It's 10:11. So are there any others in the room?
What do surviving business ledgers show was used as the unit of accounting or the currency of account? Was it continental dollars? Was it the state local currency? Was it Spanish nil dollars?
Did that come
Okay.
through, Charlie?
I think it came through. It's like trying to figure out what citizens are using as a medium of exchange.
What the ledgers from businesses?
Oh, from
Right.
businesses.
How they
I've
evolved on them.
Yeah, I've seen some of those ledgers, and I've actually done some of the what are you using by looking at like a time series of contracts or advertisements in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and try to use that to infer what people are using. What I see is like in a lot of business ledgers, what they seem to do is convert any money they're using into something that's familiar. So I'm a little familiar with Pennsylvania and some of the business ledgers there. And what you see is they're keeping their ledgers in Pennsylvania pounds. And they're doing this all the way up, and some of them up to like 1820 when there's no Pennsylvania pounds in existence. And what they're doing is whatever they're being paid in, they're doing an algorithm conversion into this so they can keep a common account. When I looked at contracts and contract usage, it seems like once the Continental dollar ceases to circulate in 1781, there's a rapid switch into Pennsylvania pounds in Pennsylvania. And that's what's being used in contracts. But in forward agreements in these contracts, there's a little tendency to use hard currency. In other words, British guineas or Spanish silver dollars or something like that. So they're using the Pennsylvania paper money after the revolution in the 1780s. But for a forward contract, for something to be paid in the future, they tend to switch towards coins. When I look at the Continental dollar, the best I can do is look at what's happening in Pennsylvania Gazette for advertisements. I got like 15,000 advertisements, and I look at what money is being used, whether it's a reward or a sale price or things like that. And I get almost a dominant use of Continental dollars in that advertising once it's made a legal tender. Once it's not made illegal, once the states take away the legal tender of the Continental dollar in 1780, and Congress asked them to do that when they changed the redemption structure. Once they do that, Continental dollars stop being used in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and it looks like they shift over to pounds, meaning Pennsylvania pounds. So that's the best I can tell you in terms of what I've seen, and it's still a problem of I wish we had a video camera and we could see what's in people's hands when they exchange things, but we don't have that.
Okay, let's try to squeeze in one more question from online because I know we have some left there. So Try to go through one more pretty quick.
All right, what's your take on the 1775 issue of the fractional issues, the 1/6, 1/3, 1/2 and 2/3 dollar issues? Was it perhaps the idea that, you know, these would be used as a circulating medium and, you know, for small change?
Yeah, that's really puzzled me when I've gone down and looked at it's the only emission, and I don't show you the next 6 emissions, but that's the only emission 3 that has these fractions of a dollar. And there aren't many units. There's not much value there. And I can't figure out why they're doing that. Again, they don't tell us anything. So that's kind of puzzled me. I don't know if it was an initial experiment. I wish I had the minutes of the people in the Continental Treasury where they sit around and say, oh, for emission 3, we need some tiny money. You know, they don't do that. So it's been a puzzle to me. And then they don't do it in any other emission, which again says maybe this was just problematic in some way. If you go look at colonial currency, they have all sorts of fractions of a pound, you know, shillings, you know, a 2 shilling note, things like that. The one thing I will say is, unlike emissions in the colonies or in the States, most emissions in the colonies would set aside a large chunk to be swapped dollar or pound for pound for paper money that got ruined. You know, it got worn out or damaged, and they set aside a large chunk. Continental dollar, they never do this. They only do it once, and they set aside a really tiny amount to do this. That the best I can see is it's what you'd replace bills that got damaged in storage from, say, water seepage or something, but not anything that gets worn out in usage. So if you got a Continental dollar and it's getting used a lot and it's getting worn out, you can't exchange it for a new one. It's just not there. Today, if you walk into the Federal Reserve and say, I got a worn out Continental dollar, they'll give you a new one, you know. So again, there are certain puzzling things there that I don't know how to explain.
All right, then that is going to have to wrap us up for this one. If you had any questions that we weren't able to get to, you're welcome to send them in through us. Go to nnpsymposium.org, contact us, and just let us know who it's for, and we'll happily pass it along. So next, starting up at 10:30 Central, we will have Benjamin Franklin and numismatics. It's our feature video for this symposium, and we'll be joined by Ben Franklin himself. So join us for that one. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in. All of the presentations are being recorded. The recordings will be available in about 2 to 3 weeks. If you would like to receive an email when those are up, you're welcome to join our mailing list. It's on our website, or if you're here in the room, you can add your email to the sheet here at the front. So
can I say one more thing real quick?
Absolutely, go for it.
If you haven't seen it, there's a technical science article on Benjamin Franklin analyzing the paper and ink he used and some of the amazing findings that's coming out. I forget where it's at, but it's circulating a bit. And it's a real scientific article to take a look at. Thank you very much.
The author of that article is actually our noon presenter.
Okay, great. That is fascinating. That is fascinating. You got to see that. Thank you very much.
Great. All right. Thank you.